I would like to start this video by giving a slight disclaimer. While a lot of the more sociologically inclined stuff is backed up by lots of research, a lot of this video is merely an opinion piece. Whether or not something is good queer representation is completely subjective, and it will differ depending on who you ask. Today we will be talking about heteronormativity in media, specifically in video games, so this video is not a million hours long, and how it impacts queer people in society. Firstly, we need to understand what heteronormativity is. Heteronormativity is the assumption that everyone is straight and all must conform to gender roles and norms associated with hetero relationships. In order to understand heteronormativity's relation to sociology, we need to explain two sociological concepts that this topic could fall under: conflict theory and system justification theory. Conflict theory is best defined as there being conflict in society because of competition for limited resources. An example that pertains to this specific subject would be the media itself being a resource and queer people and heterosexual people being the competing parties. System justification theory is best defined as being people who will continue to justify a system or way of life if it continues to provide a status quo or sense of normalcy, even if that system does not benefit them. An example of this would be the system of heteronormativity itself, and how queer people will fill roles seen in heterosexual relationships just to justify their relationship as more acceptable in the eyes of heteronormative society. So how does this all relate to sociology? The term heteronormativity is a sociological term itself, and is often used by sociologists to identify discrepancies between heterosexual people and queer people in society. It looks at social privilege gained by fitting into heteronormative molds and marginalizes those who don't. When people understand the social consequences of heteronormativity, we can break down stigmas about queer people and close the gaps in all aspects of life. The reason why I chose to look at heteronormativity specifically in media via video games is because nowadays it is such a widespread part of our culture. Having different types of representation in video games is important because it allows its audience to see themselves in the game. Good queer representation in media matters. Today we are going to go through 4 different examples of queer representation in media and how they either defy or were impacted by heteronormativity. I'll then explain how the topic of queer representation and heteronormativity goes with conflicts and system justification theory. And finally, we'll talk about why the quality of representation matters and what can happen without adequate queer representation. Let's play Spot That Queer. Is it A, Ryan Dillon? Is it B, Tom Johnson? Is it C, Alex? Or is it D, Simon? You have 15 seconds to choose and lock in your final answer. Ding, 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 ding. If you picked any of these, you were right, but also wrong. The answer was all of them. And these fellows are going to be our 4 examples for today. We will go through each one, explain their queerness, and then dive into how heteronormativity impacted the true level of the quality of representation each character is, whether that be by challenging heteronormative stereotypes or tropes, or by falling victim to queer erasure. I will preface this by saying none of these examples are all good or all bad. I wish I had time to do a deep dive, but I don't. Dylan and Ryan from The Quarry. Starting off strong with The Quarry is a choose-your-own-adventure game based off of the idea of the 80s slasher films that take place at summer camps. The game follows a group of camp counselors who get stuck at the summer camp because of Jacob. This is Jacob wanting to spend more time with Emma. Long story short, this ends up messing everything up, and they end up being hunted by a bunch of monsters that turn out to be werewolves. Anywho, throughout the game, the player has the option to see Dylan and Ryan flirt and have a budding romance. At first, it's seemingly an unlikely match, as Dylan is described as having quote-unquote a blasé attitude and being very outgoing, whereas Ryan is very stoic and would prefer to listen to his podcast instead of being social. Basically, what turns out to happen over the course of the game is that Dylan is the unambiguously gay camp counselor and has a huge crush on Ryan. And Ryan is more of the ambiguous bisexual who has the option to make a huge move in their back and forth flirtatious banter and take it to the next level. He can kiss Dylan whilst playing Truth or Dare. We're going to look at the two clips, one of which being them flirting together and one of them being the kiss.
Whoa, look at this old thing. Hey, give me your number. I want to try it out.
Why?
So that I can ask you out on a date.
Smooth.
I think if I tried a cell phone number on this thing, it would just explode.
The rest of this clip is just stereotypical slasher stuff. So we're going to move forward.
And I dare you to kiss either Caitlin or Dylan.
Wow. I mean, I guess both is off the table.
Sorry, I don't make the rules.
I mean, you literally just did, but okay. Let's do this. Dylan, let's go. Always happy to please.
Dylan then proceeds to walk back to his seat a little flustered, but we gotta move on. The best part of their budding romance is that in order to get the good ending of the game where everyone lives, you don't have to sacrifice one of them for the good of the group. Oftentimes in horror media, there tends to be the bury your gays trope, which usually ends up with a white-hot straight woman as the final girl and requiring a gay sacrifice to get to that point. The concept of the final girl itself breaks the norm in a cishet feminism kind of way, but usually involves the death of a queer person, as I mentioned before, to get there. Like in a lot of pieces of horror-based media, like It Chapter 2 or many others. Most times the death of the queer person wasn't necessary. It was simply a way for queer screenwriters back in the day to get some form of representation without severe backlash or violation of a really old Hollywood code from like the 60s, 70s, 80s. The Hays Code, or Motion Picture Production Code, which disallowed anything of a perverse nature, including queer representation. They would either villainize or queer off the queer people in the movies or shows just to have some sense of representation. The bury your gays trope is harmful because it tells the audience that the queer people were more expendable than their cishet counterparts, seeing as they were so insignificant to the story that they could die much sooner and have less of an impact. Or, on the flip side, with the villainizing of queer people, it leads to the negative stigma and fear-mongering against queer people, because the villain was either canonically queer or heavily queer-coded. This type of representation, where the queer people dying isn't a huge plot point in the story, is important, as it allows its queer audience to be seen and challenges harmful stereotypes perpetuated by heteronormativity. This game isn't without its flaws, however, when it comes to its portrayal of Dylan and Ryan's relationship. But I have some more examples to get to. If you want a more in-depth analysis of Ryan and Dylan's relationship and the problems with it, I'll have that linked at the end of the video. Moving away from the 80s style slasher games, we're going back to the 50s, the Cold War, with Tom Thompson from 60 Parsecs. If you know anything about the 50s and the 60s, you know that it wasn't accepting of queer people. 60 Parsecs is a sequel game to the survival game 60 Seconds, and is set up in a similar format, but with a few extra features, like romanceable crewmates. The basic concept is you have 60 seconds to gather your crewmates and supplies before the atomic bombs go off. And once you are on the escape pod with your chosen captain and 3 other crew members, the escape pod is blown 60 parsecs away from Earth. Your goal now is to find a planet and land safely. One of the new concepts in the game that there wasn't before in 60 Seconds is this thing called morale. Essentially, it's your relationship with your crewmates. Depending on your actions, your crewmates can become traitorous or even your soulmate, and it's that soulmate aspect we're really going to focus on. If the player chooses to play as a male captain that isn't Tom Thompson, like Baby Bronco, the dude in green, or Emmett Ellis, the guy in orange, and then reaches soulmate status with Tom Thompson, the player will get a special end card for him upon reaching a good ending, and Tom still being alive. It reads as the following. Tom always suspected that he was somehow different from his male colleagues, but it was only in his feelings for Captain Ellis that he finally found the courage to be himself. One thing's for sure, Emmett eventually got really good at recognizing the difference between Tom's lies and his truths. This is incredibly ambiguous in its phrasing, but just enough that it's A, time period appropriate, and B, perfectly fitting to Tom Thompson's character. For context, he's basically like a pathological liar. No one really knows if he's telling the truth or not. Like, for example, he claimed to have all sorts of jobs. Most of them probably weren't true. Now, Tom Thompson, moving on, he is important to the conversation because he also challenges stereotypes presented by heteronormativity. The game 60 Parsecs itself feels like a social commentary on all sorts of issues, but society sweeping under the rug of queer people is a big one with Tom. Here's my reasoning. He claims to have worked in the military a lot, like all sorts of jobs. I think he was like a cook, a sergeant, a lieutenant, drill sergeant, whatever. And I believe that there is some sense of truth to that. Let me explain. Astro Citizen, the space program the crew works for, is full of so-so rejects or people with no goals. For example, Megan Man is old, retired, and looking for purpose. Baby Bronco was raised on crime and stumbled in by accident, and his parents never cared and said that he always strong-armed himself into more trouble than he was worth. Emmett Ellis was always bullied growing up and now worked as a chemistry teacher where he was highly underappreciated. April Angeli was always ridiculed by her family for simple stuff like being an artist and looking at stars, and eventually she got into a fight with them and left. Dee Dee Dawkins is a caffeine-addicted woman who used to be a figure skater but had to stop because of an injury that put her out of it for good. And now she just lives her life working at some crummy diner. The thing that all of these people have in common is that they all have been sort of shunned by society in their own personal way. Tom Thompson is no different. He is a gay man who is discharged for it. That used to be the queer experience that no one wants to talk about from the 50s. That right there was the reality for many. And it's because of heteronormativity that we had things like that. This is a good representation because it shows the struggle that used to come with being queer in America. And in some countries, that struggle still applies. Moving on, we're going to talk about Alex from Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is an open-world sandbox game where basically all you do is farm. But alongside farming, there is a small town where there are many eligible bachelors and bachelorettes. One of these bachelors is Alex. Now, the reason I've singled Alex out is because he is a product of the generational effects heteronormativity can have on people. Yes, 4 other people of the 10 romanceable characters, 5 in total, make comments about having never felt this way about a guy or girl before the farmer, if the farmer is the same sex as the romanceable character, but Alex is different, because he says this: I kept telling myself, you can't have these kinds of feelings for another guy. But my heart was telling me something else. The phrase, I can't have these kinds of feelings for another guy, is the important bit there. Why would he say that? Well, the devil's in the details, and the deets are all pointing towards George, Alex's grandfather, with whom he lives with. In response to the male farmer and Alex's relationship, he says this if the farmer's friendship with him isn't very high. How can two men get married? It's unnatural. I guess I'm just old-fashioned. Later, if the farmer chooses to befriend George, he will be better about his old-fashioned homophobia, but that's besides the point. This right here makes Alex such a good piece of queer representation because he is a direct parallel to the effect heteronormativity can have on individual queer folk in real life. A lack of proper representation leads to a lack of understanding, which leads to things like homophobia in George's case or internalized homophobia in Alex's case. Simon from Detroit Become Human. So we've gone through a direct defiance of heteronormativity and two example parallels to the real-world impacts. Now let's talk about the effects of queer erasure. In Detroit Become Human, you can play as three characters, one of them being a guy named Marcus. He's the guy in the middle. He's basically a robo-Jesus, and when you play as Marcus, you can have a romance arc with a female android named North, the woman on the left. But what seems to be just a bromance, with nothing directly stated with Simon, another male android, the one on the right. Originally in the game, Simon was going to be a romanceable option for Marcus, and a lot of players agree that Simon had more chemistry with Marcus than North, depending on the playstyle. What I mean is that when you play as Marcus, you have two different ways you can invoke a revolution against humans, either pacifist or violent. Some players have pointed out that on the pacifist route, Marcus and North seems forced, myself included as someone who has played the game. Apparently, there was supposed to be another romance arc to parallel North, Simon, but it was taken out of the game before its release. On the Detroit Become Human subreddit, David Cage, the game developer, went on to answer any questions the players had about the game. He put photographic proof that it was him onto the subreddit before posting. Someone had asked why North was romanceable but Simon wasn't, even though they had many similar events. Here's what he had to say. We considered the option for Marcus to have other love interests, but the amount of permutations that it would have triggered in the script would have been pretty unmanageable. We chose to privilege the relationship with North, but a relationship with another male character would have worked as well. Now, the sentence, we chose to privilege the relationship with North, is the important bit there. That sentence right there is the effect of heteronormativity. Because of heteronormativity, the world isn't ready for a main character to be openly queer. Earlier in the game before this, it touched on the topic of having queer characters in games, with a chapter surrounding the Eden Club with these two Tracys who were in love with each other. The scene with the Tracys is brief, in which they can either run off or get shot by Connor, another character you can play as. But a subtle detail with the Tracys is if Connor chooses to shoot them, the game punishes him. He gets ridiculed heavily. For example, Hank Anderson, the lieutenant in this game, who is one of Connor's closest allies, gets his relationship status with Connor decreased extensively. And he goes so much as to mockingly congratulate Connor on completing his mission. Now, I've probably confused you by this point on whether or not this was good representation or queer erasure. But long story short, it's both. It has good representation with the Tracys, and the game doesn't bat an eye like it's just and the game doesn't bat an eye like they're just as normal as a straight couple, because they are. But on the other hand, Simon is left to be a queer-coded sidekick to Marcus, his longing unknown to the other. Now, you've probably been waiting for me to tie this back to those two fancy theories I mentioned earlier, conflict and system justification. Conflict theory is present in the idea of heteronormativity in media because the representation is a resource valuable to all groups in society, and there is an imbalance between who has it. We saw the effects of heteronormativity with Simon from Detroit Become Human having his romance with Marcus be scrapped instead of North's. System justification theory is present in all of them, because in some way all 4 of these examples go against the idea of supporting the concept of heteronormativity as a way of life. Though they are all flawed pieces of representative media, it still matters a lot. Small steps are important towards the big goal of dismantling heteronormativity and its effects. Now, why does this matter? I hear you asking. Well, there's a lot of reasons it matters, mainly because, as I had said once before, a lack of representation leads to a lack of understanding, which leads to a bunch of other things, like the support of a patriarchal society with inequalities against women, and many other types of things. And now, heteronormativity, it's not just a queer issue. It impacts queer people the most, but it also perpetuates things like toxic masculinity and, as I mentioned before, a patriarchal society. In Behavior Without Beliefs, Profiles of Heteronormativity and Well-Being Among Heterosexual and Non-Heterosexual University Students in Chile, by Legia Orellana, Tatiana Alarcón, Berta Schnettler, they said this: heteronormativity negatively affects all people because it relates to power and hierarchical relations, idealization of specific types of relationships and families, rigid gender norms and stereotypes, normalization of sexual coercion, and among others. Basically, essentially what this quote is saying is that heteronormativity doesn't benefit anyone in reality. Yes, it seems like it does because it puts straight people and hetero people, which interchangeable, onto this pedestal holding the power, and they are at the top of the hierarchy. And it idealizes what they think is normal, but in reality it just perpetuates negative stigma and negative things like those rigid gender norms and ideas of what family should be, and etc., etc. And another reason that a lot of this interpretation is important was explained best by Laron Reedus in his video essay on this same topic. Creators who want to put our stories on the big screen under the banners of Disney, Warner Brothers, and the like have to fight both tooth, nail, and claw for it to not just be a queer speck but in a bigger narrative subconsciously catered to heterosexuality that is only left to interpretations. Basically, what this is saying is that it is important to have good queer representation in media because so many creators have fought to have their queer representation on the big screens. And that's just the big screens. Not everyone is active on those things, and we cannot rely on just that. So it's important that we have queer representation in all forms of media, like video games. Now, this type of representation allows for queer people to be seen. And for the positive impacts of having queer representation in media, the article titled Media Representation and Heteronormativity by Quinn Johnson had said it best. It was not until I really started engaging with queer media that I stopped feeling so alienated from society anymore. That was when my mental health started improving and I started to feel more normal. It's the fact that he said that he started to feel more normal when he saw people like him on media. It is important that we have the representation of everyone at some point with good representation, because it doesn't alienate or marginalize people from society. It encourages a collective group of people working together instead of an us versus them ideology, which is important for the function of society and also the function of individuals. And in the essay, The Impact of Representation in the Media for Young Queer People by Nayantara Narayanan, it says, while we are far away from complete inclusion, even small steps forward are important, and this includes making the queer community feel seen and represented in the media they consume. So it goes to show that having good queer representation in the media we consume is important when it comes to dismantling heteronormativity. It's important because without it, queer people are left to fend for themselves against the perpetuative stigmas heteronormativity pins on them. And we need to dismantle those stigmas in order to have a functioning society and functioning people. Here are my sources. Da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time. I know it's probably way too long, but I appreciate it.